Just a silly little boy playing game. And if someone ran at you in battle, you'd run away crying like a baby.
Why losers play video games. I'll show you the proof that you're a loser if you're playing a video game.
But is that a dwelling on what is pure, lovely, and worthy of praise? Soldiers come back with PTSD for a reason. I just don't think that that's fit for Christians to be doing that.
But despite certain people preaching against video games, many Christians still continue to play them. So what makes this topic so divisive? Are Christians today just not listening? Or is there something these pastors are missing? Well, today we're going to investigate. Where do these mixed opinions come from? What are the dangers of playing video games? And most importantly, what does the Bible say about this? So firstly, where do these objections come from? Most objections to Christians playing video games go something like this. 1. Are they a waste of our time? Do video games become idols in our lives? 2. Do they promote violence? Are they harmful to our spiritual health? 3. Aren't video games meant for children? Aren't men supposed to be men? And 4. Do video games lead to poor behaviour? Now admittedly, I've got a slightly controversial take on one of these topics, particularly violence in video games. But before we dive into these points, there's something we need to make clear first. Many people often make this decision uneducated on what video games are truly like. So in order to make a fair judgment on this topic, let's get a brief overview of what we mean to play video games. As many people I hear preaching and talking on this topic actually have no first-hand idea of the content they're covering.
Are you even familiar with video games? And I have to confess to you, the answer to that question is no. No, I'm really not all that familiar with video games.
If that sounds like you, let me quickly bring you up to speed on what we mean by video games in 2025. Now, video games can be played across multiple devices, anything from consoles and computers all the way up to mobile phones. And games can be divided up into specific categories. Popular genres include adventure games where you play as the main character as if you were in a story, simulators like flight simulators where you're a pilot, or farming simulators where you do farm tasks. Now, video game farm tasks aren't exactly my idea of fun, but some people enjoy it. There are also sports games like FIFA and NBA 2K where you play as your favourite athletes, as well as FPS games which are shooter games from a first-person perspective. Alongside this you have strategy games, puzzle games, racing games, you name it. Now when talking about gaming, most people will probably be referring to story-based games or multiplayer. Multiplayer is any game where you compete with or against other people online and is by far probably the most popular way of playing. Popular games here include Fortnite and Call of Duty, and we'll touch back on these later. Most people play video games as a way to relax or a source of entertainment, kind of like TV used to be for the older generations. But imagine this. Rather than you just watching the experience, these games are often so realistic. You have the power to influence the characters and control your own story. You can be a pirate, an athlete, fight aliens, solve murder mysteries, drive cars. You really have the option to do just about anything. So it's no wonder video games are becoming so popular amongst the younger generations. But it's also more than this. It's a way to socialize. Contrary to belief, if used right, video games can be a great way to build friendships and maintain friendships. Well, now we have a better understanding of what video games are. Let's see if the criticisms on it are fair. Are video games a waste of time? Are they idols in our lives? Well, Exodus 20 verse 3 tells us you should have no other gods before me. We should give God the glory in our lives and he should have the priority. However, this isn't a problem specific to video games. Hear me out here. There are plenty things in our lives like money, sports, traveling, even relationships that can all become the center of our lives and they can all push God away from the center. And if that's the case, anything but God at the center of your lives, get out of there. Whether it's video games or anything else, fix your eyes upon Jesus. Now Psalm 90:12 also tells us to teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. We're told to be discerning and wise with our time. The key here is to ask God for wisdom. holding ourselves accountable in how much time that we spend on our hobbies. But rather than just holding yourself accountable, why not have someone you live with hold you accountable for how much time you invest in your hobbies? Why not set restrictions on the hours you play? Why not ask yourself each week, have I spent more time with God or more time playing video games? Let's try to limit the possibility of video games ever becoming an idol in the first place. Now, another danger of making video games idols in our lives is this. Some people say they play video games to unwind and get away from their busy lives. And look, I have absolutely no issue with this, as this is just a form of relaxing and it is biblical to take rest. However, the danger is make sure that your renewal of strength is coming from God. Jesus tells us in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Our strength comes from the Lord, so don't use video games as your first reference for renewal of strength. Instead, let it come from the Lord. But I hope one thing is clear here. Video games do not have to become idols in our lives, and we can actually even use it for the glory of God. We are called to be in the world, just not of it. And for me, I've actually had fantastic evangelistic conversations with people through video games, so it can be used for God's glory. Sometimes our lives are often very busy and it feels hard to fit God into our lives. But rather than thinking video games as something separate, why not ask God to be with you in your hobbies and spend time with Him there, and look for opportunities to be a witness even through video games? Secondly, do video games promote violence? Are they harmful to our spiritual health? Now, many Christians would probably agree, as long as it's in moderation, video games as a whole are okay. But the big issue most Christians have is when it comes to violent video games. That's often where people draw the line. But what if I told you I think that some violent video games are actually okay? Now, I am open to having my mind changed here, but let me explain first. I think the idea people build up in their heads is often actually worse than the reality. For anybody who doesn't play video games, the concept of killing each other in a shooting game sounds awful. And when you put it like that, of course it does. But I don't think that would be a very fair description. Let's use this same logic for paintball, for example. Christians should stop playing paintball because you're inflicting pain on others and using guns to shoot people. Well, while both of these things remain true, I don't think that's the best or fairest description of it. It would be quite a stretch to draw that conclusion because there's clearly no bad intention behind it. In a similar way, video games are shooting at pixels on a screen, and if anything, in comparison to our paintball example, there's no pain even involved in this. One popular game, Fortnite for example, where you shoot vegetable characters, fish people and other cartoon characters. It's quite clearly fantasy. Now, any sane person wouldn't argue that playing Mario Kart causes more car crashes, so why do we say shooter games promote more violence? However, maybe you're still utterly unconvinced and you don't feel comfortable with the concept. Now, I do get there is a personal conviction here, and I totally understand that. But often what I see in relation to video games is people enforcing their personal convictions upon others. Let's look at the popular board game chess. When you capture one of the other opponent's pieces, you aren't thinking about murdering the knight or the pawn or the queen here. Or when you're playing Cluedo, you aren't thinking it's glamorizing murder. You're simply outplaying your opponents through strategy and skill in a game. And that's a window into what video games are like. Even games like Call of Duty, which is a war game by the way, it doesn't feel like you're murdering people. That would be an unfair description. Instead, you're shooting at pixels on a screen to outplay your opponent. Now, a danger here and a valid point would be that you do not want to expose yourself to bad language or sexual content, which does appear in some games. And I will say there are certain types of games that I do think we should avoid. And if you don't want to support those companies, that's completely understandable. I'm not saying every violent game is good. However, in most cases, these are optional modes and don't appear in the majority of video games. Furthermore, if you're watching movies with bad language, violence, and sexual scenes, I would argue the problem is much bigger than video games here, and actually you're holding a double standard. You're still consuming that content even if you're not playing it. And the final danger to point out on this point is Hebrews 10:24 tells us, "And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another." We are not called to live in isolation, but instead to encourage one another. If staying up all night on video games is hindering you going to church and getting encouragement yourself and encouraging others, then it is wrong. If video games are stopping you from spending time with the church family, they're disconnecting you, making you feel lonely, irritable, or depressed, then it is time to take a step back from video games. Point 3. Are video games for children? Don't men need to be men? Well, let's take a look at what the Bible says is a biblical definition of a man or husband, as the husband is the man, just in a marriage context. Ephesians 5:23 says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." A husband is called to lead. 1 Timothy 5:8 tells us anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. There is a responsibility financially, emotionally, and spiritually for a man. 1 Corinthians 16:13. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Men are meant to stand strong and firm in their faith, resisting temptation and pushing others towards God. Proverbs 25:28 paints a similar picture. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. We are told to have self-control. And finally, Mark 10:45 tells us, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many." Biblical men are meant to be servant-hearted and Christ-like. Now there's other verses I could mention here too, but you get the picture. At least to me, there is nothing in the Bible to indicate that video games does not make you a man. Now, if it is taking your time away from your family or responsibilities or affecting your faith in any way, then yes, you do need to grow up and take accountability. As we said in the last point, your priorities should be spending time with God, your partner, your local church, your family, your Christian brothers and sisters. But if you're faithfully following Christ in all those areas, then what you do in your personal time, well, why not enjoy games? Video games are very different from when they first came out, and they're very much tailored to both children and adults. Same thing you have with sports. Just because children play sports does not mean that adults cannot play it either. From a biblical standpoint, this point has always baffled me because it has absolutely no bearing on what makes a biblical man. It is just certain people's opinions that don't like video games, and therefore they want to press their opinions on others, which is actually quite alarming when pastors do that. Now the fourth and final point, does gaming lead to poor behaviour? Colossians 3:8 says this, "But now you must rid yourselves of all things such as these, anger, rage, malice, slander and filthy language from your lips." Now as Christians, we all have moments that we aren't proud of. No matter what you do, you are going to slip up once or twice. We are still sinful people. If a car cuts you off on the road to work, I'm sure you've probably thought some things that are particularly unhelpful. But as Christians, the Spirit is meant to work in our lives and change our hearts, and this is mentioned in Galatians 5:22. But the fruits of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We are called to have gentleness, joy, kindness, and self-control. And if video games are taking you away from those things, then you need to stop. Everyone has their bad days, sure, but is it constantly leading you to a state of rage every time you play? Is it constantly leading you to bad language, profanity? Ask yourself this question. If someone was there in the room with you, would you say you're living as a good witness to Christ? As Jesus says in Matthew 18 verse 9, if your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or feet and be thrown into eternal fire. Although Jesus is clearly using hyperbole here, he's showing us just how bad sin is. Now we are to cut this out, and if video games are a source of that sin, we should cut it out of our lives. Jesus tells us if you love him, follow his commands. Turn away from that old life, instead follow Jesus on what is going to glorify God. Now this is truly one of the harder things to discern, and one thing that I personally will have to take a look at myself. Anyway, to conclude, firstly, if you've enjoyed the video, drop a like and subscribe, it really does help the channel. But here is a quick summary to conclude. Overall, I think Christians are able to play video games as long as they're still faithfully serving the church and Christ and have their partners in the right place. Then why not go ahead and play video games? Of course there are the dangers that we've mentioned, but they often occur in other areas too. They aren't video game specific, but video games can even be a fantastic evangelism tool. So I'd really be interested in this video to see whether you agree with me or disagree with me on certain points. Let me know why you do or don't. I'd be really interested to know what you guys think. Anyway, let me know what topics to cover, and until the next time, I will see you soon.